Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to today's webinar, Breaking the Barrier to Continuous Testing and How to Generate Rich Data and Environments on Demand. My name is Mark Lambert, and we'll be walking you through today's presentation. But before we go ahead and start, let's move forward with just a little bit of housekeeping for the Zoom webinar. First of all, thank you for joining. As I said, everybody's lines are muted. If you have questions, please go ahead and fill in the Q&A box. I will be reviewing those questions as we go through today's presentation and curating them for the end for our presenters to answer as we get towards the end of the session. If you run into any technical difficulties, please also use the chat. And there's also a raise your hand feature. So if you could just raise your hand if you're able to hear me okay and you're able to see today's screen, that would be great. I see a few hands. Thank you. That's perfect. Okay, so let's get into it. As I said, my name is Mark Lambert. I'm the Vice President of Products at Parasoft Corporation, and I'm joined by two great gentlemen. First of all, my good friend Hugh Price, Managing Director from Curiosity Software in Ireland. Hugh's one of the pioneers in the industry for test data and also model-based testing. So hopefully we'll have some interesting questions as we go through today. And then I'm also joined by my good friend and colleague, Chris Colosimo, who is the product manager of the Parasoft functional testing suite. So let's get into it and let's talk about what we're trying to enable today. What we're trying to do today is to talk about how you can make continuous testing a reality in your organization. And why do we need continuous testing? And really, what is it? So really, continuous testing is all about how we can help organizations realize the goals of Agile and help the organizations like yours deliver great software to market in the most effective way possible. If we think about what the goal of Agile is, the goal of Agile isn't to necessarily deliver all of the functionality, a complete product to market quicker. It's to deliver it iteratively. It's to deliver it in small pieces that can be consumed by your key stakeholders, that might be your end users, and consume that in a way where you can get feedback and you can improve the overall direction of the product so ultimately you deliver the right thing for the market. However, when you talk to many organizations who are trying to deliver on Agile, they run into the challenges of, in essence, an overhead associated with each of those iterations. Okay, so how do we unblock that? How do we remove those bottlenecks? We do that through the use of DevOps. DevOps is the, kind of the industry term for how we can automate the delivery process of our technology and our capabilities out to those stakeholders and ultimately those end users. Now, what we know from industry surveys is that when we bring together Agile and DevOps together into a unified process, we're actually able to not only improve efficiency of the delivery of that functionality, but also improve the quality of what is being delivered. And the key here is automation. The key is that the automation is in place so that we can automate the delivery process, so we can automate the build process, but also so we can automate the test process. Because if we become reliant on a manual testing practice, then that is the link in our chain that's going to break. It's the bottleneck in our process that's going to slow us down. So what we need is we need test automation to move us forward. But the trouble is test automation is a point in time. What we need to do to be able to know that we can release with confidence is to be able to run test automation continuously, running it through every phase of our cycle and giving us immediate feedback onto the quality of the application as it's being developed, not waiting until the end of the process and just focusing on when it's delivered. But that's easier said than done. The problem is that doing test automation is one problem, but the other problem is actually the complexity of the application that you're testing. Your application is no longer just one interface. It's a whole variety of different interfaces, mobile, web, maybe even headless interfaces like APIs, which often power a lot of the modern web applications. But then also you have a whole bunch of back-end dependencies as well, third-party systems, internal APIs, back-end databases, and they represent challenges. So how do I test this complex environment? Well, I start by testing individual interfaces, but the thing is that's not going to scale. What I need to be able to do is I need to be able to validate a unified experience across each of these interfaces. I need to also be able to validate these interfaces within the same project delivery. So I need to have a way where I can test each of these without having to go to completely different tools and completely different reporting infrastructure each time. This is where Parasoft provides test automation technology through Parasoft SOAtest for API testing and true omni-channel testing scenarios, as well as the Parasoft Selenium product, which is designed to supercharge your existing Selenium testing practice, plugging in straight into your Selenium tests to remove challenges associated with maintenance and stability of those Selenium tests. Now, these tests on the front end can be then re-leveraged to do non-functional tests such as performance or security-oriented tests. And then what I have now is I have a nice test automation infrastructure. I have a whole bunch of processes that are running in a fully automated manner. But I run into the real problem. And the real problem when organizations look to try and enable continuous testing is that of the test environment. And the test environment is not just your application, it's all of these external dependencies, where I start having different constraints, different issues associated with them. Maybe there's a third-party service that is not available to me 24/7. Maybe I have a fee associated with accessing a test silo, for example. I can't necessarily control the behavior of that external dependent system. That's actually very common, especially within a microservices world where I might own the back-end system, but getting it to be in the correct state, and more importantly, getting to have the correct data. And that's going to be the focus of what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about how we can address the data issues within my test environment and how I can simulate those behaviors so I can reuse my test environment for both functional but also non-functional testing, and how I can streamline it to enable shift-left performance testing. So why is data a problem? Well, you know, it's many organizations today are struggling with something that's pretty key: GDPR and PII. So protecting people's data and protecting the information around your customers is a very real problem and a very real challenge that many organizations are trying to protect. Now, because of these tricks and because of these difficulties, should I say, and because we can't just simply take production data and use it in our test environment, which, by the way, if you're doing that, be very, very careful. We'll touch upon a couple of those things in a second. Because we can't just reuse that, finding the right data, sanitizing the right data, it costs a lot of time, it costs a lot of effort, and what it ultimately leads to is defects in production because we're not thoroughly testing our application, either because we can't, because we don't have the data that we need, or because it just takes too long and we're under business pressures to release something and it's like, well, we've tested it, we just haven't run through all of the scenarios. So ultimately, what that's going to lead to is to defects in production. And actually also, if you're using production data, it could actually lead to violations of GDPR requirements and PII requirements if your test data potentially leaks out of your test environment as well. So with that being said, let's talk through some of the solutions here and how I'm going to hand over to Chris. So Chris, why don't you talk about how we can solve some of these and walk us through how you would start building your continuous testing a test environment.
Thanks, Mark. So yeah, absolutely. We know that once we drill into those back-end systems, test data does become a problem. And so there's a few solutions that are out there to solve this challenge. Three traditional approaches. The first one is cloning or copying your production database. this gets you all of the data that you need, but it can be expensive and take a long time to get the right data, and then you have to deal with refreshes. And of course, as Mark pointed out earlier, um, making sure that you don't have sensitive data in those production databases is a huge concern that you have to think about all the time. So organizations then say, well, maybe we could look at subsetting or sampling the production database. This is the process of taking just a little bit of the data, whatever you need to satisfy those particular use cases. This is good because you're not grabbing all the data from that production system. You can sort of choose what it is that you want. But this is really difficult from a technical perspective because you have all sorts of referential integrity, making sure that different data tables link together and making sure that for the use cases that you're trying to cover, you have all of the correct data. And it takes a pretty keen mind to understand all of the different pieces that we need for that. And of course, it's still production data, so you have to think about masking for compliance. So a third option is to completely generate or synthesize the data. This is great because now you know you do not have sensitive data, and you can not only build the data that you need, but potentially go beyond that, building data that may not be able to exist in the real database. But a challenge with this is getting an expert to understand exactly what data to synthesize and all the different permutations for particular data sets that you may need. But really, the challenge or the common problem with all three of these approaches is the reliance on a shared database. And see, the way that this works is that teams will want to test against their applications, either in their local environments or in different silos, but they'll need that data from the shared database. Now, traditional test data management approaches will say, all right, well, let's go ahead and grab the data from that database, subset it, mask it, do some sort of synthesis on it, and then push that back into the database, the originating database. This not only takes time, but there's a challenge that happens when folks actually start using that data. If multiple teams are using the same data sets and they are changing the data as a function of doing the testing, you can get what's known as data pollution. Also, if we only have a limited set of data sets that we want to use, making sure that they're clean and ready to go all the time. And it really is that the data conflicts that take place in that centralized database. And we hear from a lot of organizations that, yes, I got a test data management solution, but now I'm spending so much time managing that test data that the real problems are getting lost in the noise. So there's a fourth option. And that fourth option is virtual test data, which is the process of not only simulating the data, but also simulating the database. This allows you to get a simulated environment, allowing teams to test anywhere at any time. And so the idea is that you leverage service virtualization to record the transactions against the primary database and then create simulated databases. Each user can then connect that simulated database to their application and then create exactly the test data that they need for each of their particular needs. Maybe borrowing a common definition, making some slight tweaks and using that. But this solves the challenge of data collision and gives you that environment that you can test in unconstrained. All right, so I'd like to give you a demonstration of how that works. So this is going to be a combination of Parasoft for simulating the database and then Curiosity for extending, reshaping, and generating the data. And so let me start by painting my use case. So I have an application that I want to test against. It's a little banking application. And in that banking application, it is connected to a database. I have some use cases that I want to perform. You'll see that when we get into it, there's a little accounts table. And in this accounts table, I want to ensure that I have enough accounts so that the math can be validated to make sure all the account balances equal the account total. And also, when I have enough accounts, this page or this web page should split into multiple pages. And so I want to validate those two pieces. Here's the thing. I don't actually have enough data in the real environment to do this type of testing that I want to do today. So what I've done is I actually recorded the transactions against that database, and I created a simulated database using Parasoft Virtualize. I then reconnected my application to that. From that, I am now unconstrained, and I could go in and manually create whatever data that I want in that database. But what I'm going to do to take this to the next level is show how, through integrations with Curiosity VIP Test Modeler, we can actually generate exactly the data that we need, full of all of the different connections and referential integrity, so that we can do our use cases. All right, so let's go ahead and start inside of Parasoft. So this is Parasoft, a continuous testing platform. It's a browser-based application that allows us to see our test cases, virtual services, test data, and also look at our environments so that we can understand how our different applications are connected. So this is the application we're going to be working with today, Parabank. You'll see that it'll have a front end with a series of services that will connect to some back-end systems. One of them is a database. And so currently, I'm connected to the live, or the real, database. So let's go ahead and dive into the application and see this at work. So here's the banking application we're going to be demoing on today. We'll just log in. And so here, in order to generate this table, it went and made a call to that back-end database. And so in my live environment, this is all the data that I have. And this clearly isn't enough to do the use cases that I want. And so ahead of time, for that database, I went ahead and monitored and then created a virtual service. And so I'll go ahead and switch to that virtual service now, provision, which essentially just means turning it on. And so now I've enabled that virtual service and switched the connection between the live service and the database. So now in my application, I'm now working with a virtual data source. Now this is great. Now I'm unconstrained. I have access to a simulated data source. And if I wanted to, I could come in to this data source, drill down to where the actual data is coming from, in this case right here, drill down to the actual scenario that I have, and then potentially change, maybe my account balance to have a little bit more value. And then in a manual way, then work with my application to validate a little bit of the math and start to get the paging going. But this is a challenge because I want to be able to generate data in mass, and I want that data to actually make sense. Because beyond this, I want to be able to drill into those accounts and see a combination of the different types of accounts and their balances, and it's a lot of data to create. So fortunately, we have an integration with VIP Modeler, and so I was able to do two things to connect to these two solutions together. The first thing is, under the hood, part of what's powering this is my virtual database. And the virtual database has a series of files, and as you saw, there's the web browser, so you can query that data. And so I reached out and I connected together with Hugh at Curiosity, and I said, Hugh, I have some requirements that I cannot solve with my current database. I sent him a copy of that database and then an email, and basically said, hey, I would like to have a whole bunch of data. And then for that data, I would like it to have a mixture of positive and negative accounts so I can validate my math. And then I would like to be able to drill into those accounts so that I could see a mixture of debits and credits. And so through those two artifacts, I was able to connect up with Hugh, and he was able to provide me with some great data. And so Hugh, I'd like to transfer over to you so you could show the folks how that all takes place.
Hi, Chris. I think you just got to stop sharing. There we go. I could just start sharing now. There we go. Wonders of Zoom technology. Chris, can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can. You sound great.
Okay, good. So here's your little recording database, which is actually, sorry, just move the this stuff out of the way. So here you have your recorded database, which is basically sitting at the back end. And the first thing we're going to do, so we're just going to nip into the VIP test modeler, and we're going to go, and you'll see there's all sorts of things we can do with test data. First thing I want to do is to analyze those recordings. We've got to spend a little bit of time just having a look around them. Now we've done some pre-analysis, which has just pulled out some of the tables that I know are in there. I'm just going to execute that. And this will fire it off to our test data engine. Now that engine is sitting there waiting to do all sorts of things. It could be doing masking, could be doing subsetting. Most of the stuff we're doing nowadays is kind of around sort of generating synthetic data. But you'll see here what we've done is we've analyzed that. And I'll just open it up. Let's just open up a couple of these. So the first thing we've done is we've taken a look inside your there's an awful lot of stuff going on with all that SQL, and we've basically tracked down all your CSV files, which are in effect the data that was being passed to and from your virtual database, and we've sort of created a sort of, I guess it's a base template for you to start working with. Now, if you take a look at what we've done here, you'll see we've actually found the customer. Now, if we just take a look at this, it will magically change. Now, how did we manage to do that? Now, what you'll see is that sitting inside here, we've got kind of a basic way for people to very quickly to work with test data. You know, there's some quite complicated tools out there, and we thought, well, most people are pretty familiar with Excel. So what we've got here is, if you come in here, you'll see a whole bunch of functions, about 160 of them, and all of these particular functions are very powerful. They're all, you can, if you're in Holland, you'll get different addresses, etc. But in effect, that allows us to, if we go like this, drag those down, allows us to very quickly create synthetic data, and that's in effect what I'm doing there. So let me just delete those. Now, you'll see here that we've managed to detect first name and last name and address. Now, what we've got is we've got a little regular expression. And what it will do, parser, it will look at the data that we discover and make a best guess at this. And of course, you can tune this over time. And the advantage of this is it's obviously less work because we've kind of sort of half built this for you. And in effect, that is one synthetic person. And if I want two synthetic customers, I've just got to copy it down. And bingo, I've got two synthetic customers. Now, we've kind of done the same thing with the accounts. You can see here that we've got accounts. I'll click on that. The account number is changing. And then we've got our transactions. And the transactions are basically the stuff. And if we go back to Chris's requirements here, he kind of wants a whole bunch of transactions. He's got some pagination, and he basically needs debits and credits, and they've all got to kind of total up. So that's kind of our spec. Now, if we just close those down for a moment. Now, what in effect I had to do was spend, I don't know, how long did it take? Half an hour maybe? Go through, and we created a little configuration file here. Now this configuration file, so we created a couple of customers, and I've created a couple of accounts, or two accounts, and the two accounts each. And then what it's going to allow us to do is it's going to allow us to, and then I created a whole bunch of transactions, and all I had to do was basically create positive and negative ones like so. I copied them down, and the only hard bit that I had to really do was the account here. I had to actually use an Excel function, which is basically if the accounts match, I just do a sum of the transactions with the matching. So it's just a SUMIF, which is a standard Excel function. And that was pretty much the hardest thing I had to do here. Everything else was pretty much done for me. Now, what I can do now is say, okay, so just logged off. Give me a second. Let's just go back in. So now I've got my little Parasoft here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to basically populate the Parasoft data simulation. I'm just going to pick that file up. Let's go and pick that up like so, and that is now going to fire off a job again to our batch server, and that is going to create us a bunch of CSVs, which would then go directly into the virtual database that Chris has created for us. I think we'll just wait for this. We should take a couple of seconds to finish. Actually, while we're waiting, we can have a quick look at the Hopper jobs. So just so you know what's going on in the background here, we've got all sorts of all sorts of particular jobs that are firing into the back here. Here you can see the analysis. We can do all sorts of subsetting, masking, synthetic, etc. And this can all be invoked by Jenkins to kind of provision your environments as part of that DevOps CI/CD pipeline that Mark was talking about. Now let's just take a look at this. That's populated the simulation. Let's go in and have a look at the results. And what you'll see here is basically the CSVs that we created that now can be pushed straight back in and back over to Chris. Now that's kind of the sort of basic process. Now before I hand it back, I'm just going to take it onto a slightly kind of more advanced world. I'm just going to talk a little bit about test data generally, and then I'm just going to show you how you could then move this onto a much more sophisticated level, which is to include the concepts of modeling. Now, just to give a little bit of history of the test data world, which I've been probably involved with way too long, you know, masking and subsetting were kind of the de facto world that people lived in. It's pretty clunky. Masking has become quite commoditized now. I would say that most people don't mask enough in terms of, you know, it's still pretty easy to track people down when the data's been obfuscated. There's a few data generation tools out there, and then there's some quite nice tools like Actifio, etc., and Delphix, which allow you to roll back, roll forward, and virtualize databases. However, just so you let you know what's going on out there in the real world at the moment is that we've now kind of moved into a new paradigm. You know, with the continuous development, continuous testing, you really have got to have right data, right time, right place. And this is from right at the beginning when you're maybe working on some reports, designing some business intelligence with a user, migration data, and we're actually finding a lot of the work we're doing is now things like data containerization, spinning up Docker images, you know, provisioning data in on both sides of data provisioning, putting data into Kafka queues. And there was obviously Parasoft SV around, you know, which is an excellent product, and that allows you to simulate the APIs, which is very useful. But now we've got a new sort of a new tool in the arsenal, which is the Parasoft Virtual Database, which is actually a pretty cool piece of technology in terms of helping you kind of isolate stuff off so you can do much more sophisticated joined up and integrated testing. So this is kind of the sort of next generation utilities, and that's, you know, we have basically created we coined a new term called test data automation. Strangely, lots of people seem to be copying that. That's kind of interesting. It used to be called test data management. Now, just to give you excuse me a second, just to give you kind of an idea, you know, we have a tool which contains a whole bunch of components, you know, subsetting, masking, you know, but within that there is lots and lots of other things that you need to do, allocating the data so that each test has its own set of test data, analyzing the data, looking for gaps, you know, maybe it's just moving data backwards and forwards, you know, and this idea of, you know, just-in-time data delivery, unique combinations allocated to tests. Now you'll see here that we basically have a test data catalog which sits there, and that really is the kind of shopping cart that you can then attach to your development process. I won't say testing because it could just as well be used by someone who wants to create a training environment, for example. Now you'll see that Parasoft actually figure in about 3 different places here. So obviously they have the Parasoft SOAtest, which is, you know, kind of market leading testing tool sitting over here. And in our world, we have to populate the right data associated with that, and I'll show you that a little bit later. Then there's this new Parasoft here, which is in effect, that now becomes a data source and target for us. So that allows us to push the data directly into these really interesting pieces of technology, because, you know, all of these test cases are going to use different subtle variations. This might be a mainframe here, this might be the Parasoft Virtual Database, this might be maybe an EDI file that you need to push in at the beginning. So this is kind of now the circle, or the joined up process that we really need to kind of think about. Now, sitting down the bottom here is a thing called Test Modeler. Now, Test Modeler basically allows you to kind of kick on from where we were with originally just these very basic requirements. Now, if we go back to Modeler, what you've got here, if you kind of look at the account activity, what we've done is we've actually said, well, what does Chris really want here? So there's low volume and high volume. You know, he's basically looking for high volume because he's interested in pagination. There's kind of debits and credits, and then there's a mixed mode here. And all we've really done is we've just created a little model of the data that we need. And this is where we get into our test creation. Now, what we've got here is each one of these is a distinct scenario. And I think actually probably that one is Chris's scenario, but this one isn't. You know, that's just a set of credits. So by coming in here and assigning various different coverage features and exhaustive and low and medium, and you can also pinpoint certain types of data that you want to focus on, depending on what you're up to. That allows you to basically, in effect, the little generate that you saw me submit, each one of those actually then comes in and fires that same process to create those CSV files. But here, what we've done is we've tracked, so that's actually a VIP customer, it's US dollars, it's a checking account, and that's the customer number, that's the account number, and that's the balance. So that allows me now to feed into something like SOAtest to say, well, actually, let me just validate that this screen is populating correctly, because I've actually created the data at the beginning that the screen should be checking. So you have an assertion in there, and we've actually populated that data. Now, that's account activity, but then you can say, well, that's interesting. Now let's move it up one more level and say, well, let's look at the different types of accounts that we have here, type of customers. And you see there's different types of customers. And then the main thing that we really care about is cross-currency trades here, or cross-market trades. So here I'm just picking out two currencies because I really care about the differences. And what we've done here is we've actually just dropped in the account activity. So we've just dropped it in as a subflow. Now, if you then look at the tests that we've got in here, let's look at blended tests and look at the tests. You'll see here that, again, I've just gone off, and each one of those is now a different combination of customer types, because that's actually something that we care about for another part of the system. But I've also, within them, I've also then gone and got my different types of account activity. So you've moved from what was pretty much, you know, I just need to test this, into the world of modeling. And all you've really done is just created the model, which is more of a business concept. You'll see them in every sprint meeting. You'll see them sort of written on the wall on a whiteboard. And then all we've had to do really was just attach in this little Parasoft make find customer account, which actually just is literally a set of parameters that we've just passed into the little widget. And think of this as the injector into the Parasoft world. And away we go. Now, the other thing you can do is, just finally to finish off, is we actually create a catalog, and the catalog I talked about briefly is all of the different things that we can push and pull data into, one of which is the Parasoft world. And then what we do is we also track, so here, as we've been populating this data into our virtual database, you might come at it from the other angle and say, well, we found an error. Interesting, something didn't work. So all you've got to do is say, well, where did that data come from? And what we've done is, as the data has been populated, we've actually been keeping track of the particular scenarios, test cases, associated with the data that we've been created. So if we found, for example, that a balance didn't match or an account number didn't match, then we would be able to come in here and be able to track back to the model, and the model would tell us, actually, we are not doing cross-currency trades for institutional investors correctly, because we're calculating the balance incorrectly, because we have in effect tracked that customer number, that account number. Okay, so that's sort of, I mean, you know, test data is an absolute monster area, but you know, I'm kind of the stuff that Parasoft are doing is really interesting, and I think it really helps in terms of this idea of integrated testing and being able to move data through a journey. Everything is about the data journey now. It's no longer just about a UI, you know, mobile testing, who really cares? It's all about the API. It's where does it go from there? It becomes a Kafka message. It then moves through a set of transforms. Each one of those component tests needs to be tested. And then gradually you can start introducing chained testing, where you're gradually pulling away from these virtual databases. Okay, Chris, so basically back in your world, I have now sent you the results file, which is your CSVs, and we can now go back to Chris, and Chris should be able to just carry on. Let me just stop sharing.
Wonderful, thanks, Hugh. And so I think what's quite powerful about this is that you can see how, you know, Hugh and I are playing a little bit here, but you can see how the different roles really play out. I, as a tester, have a certain set of requirements. I create my little universe there, and with the VIP test modeler, we can go so far beyond the basic use case and use that as a seed to then roll into test data management, which, as Hugh rightly points out, is the real problem. Where do you start? How do you create this scalable? Okay, so just got an email in my inbox. Hugh has sent me the data files for my particular use case. So I'm going to load these into Parasoft. And so, as I said before, the database that's sort of been powering everything is this. And I just made a copy of it and called this Parasoft Curiosity. And now what I'll do is just grab these files that I need, and I will paste them in here. And we'll override some of the ones that were common. Okay, that's great. I have everything I need. Now I'll go ahead and create a new virtual service with the data. Call this Parasoft Curiosity. And choose recorded database queries. And so here's my original ones, and here's my new ones. And I'll load that into my the browser-based data area. Yep, we'll go ahead and do that and override them. And then I now have a virtual service. So let's go and look at that. So if I jump in here, and I'll just do a quick refresh of this page, I should now have a new data source here called Parasoft Curiosity. Great. All of these different SQL transactions, and they're all loaded up with the data that I need. But the big piece is, how do I now hook this up into my environment? So I'll just jump back into my environment manager, and I'll say, okay, right now I'm using this basic virtual data source. I want to connect this to my Curiosity data source. And so that's just going to swap out that data source under the hood. I'll go ahead and provision. Watch this for a second. Yep, so it didn't actually change the database, it just configured that new data source. And so now I should be able to go into my application, and as soon as it, oh, sorry, I forgot actually one thing. I asked Hugh to give me that fictitious name at the top so that I knew how to choose the difference between the two of them. And so I just have to change that back to the actual database name, which is Parabank. Sorry about that. Okay, now I should have all the data that I need. Boy, look at that. Okay. All right, well, what were my use cases? So the first use case was if I have enough accounts that this splits into multiple pages, and it looks like I have discovered a bug. Hugh gave me a ton of data here and it's not splitting. And so that means I need to then file that into that new feature because that's not covered. But this is real data. Because we're powered by a model, that referential integrity is intact. And so I can drill down into accounts. In this particular case, I went into 210.97263, and I am in 210.9763, and not only validate the math at the top, but as Hugh was pointing out, validate this math at the bottom, and actually have a true, disconnected virtual database full of rich data that I could then take into not just one virtual service, but an entire library of virtual services with all the different business rules, associate them into the context of an environment, provision and deploy, and be able to have those dynamic environments available to me anytime, anywhere. And so obviously I've solved my use cases. And so with that, I'm going to actually hand it back to Mark to talk us through what this all means. So Mark, back to you.
Great, thanks, Chris. And some great questions, by the way. I've been trying to answer them as we've gone through, but I'll kind of reiterate some of them. And some of them I haven't got to. I thought they'd be good initial starting ones. So yeah, thank you, Chris. Thank you, Hugh. I think we've really shown how we can make continuous testing a reality here. And as I say, we'll go through a lot of the questions because I think they're very relevant and kind of help kind of paint the bigger picture. So first of all, we showed isolating the test automation from its constrained dependencies. The example here that Chris showed us and what we've been focusing on is the database itself, and using service virtualization to do that, to create a virtual database, and then controlling it through that test environment view through the web browser. We then showed how we can align the test environment with the test data, leveraging VIP to model the different data scenarios. And really the breadth of capabilities there is massive from the point of view of how we can build the different scenarios. And as you can see, using a module to create different data sets for different purposes for different teams. And then lastly, bringing that all together back into that thin client interface where we're able to dynamically reconfigure the environment, but also where we can dynamically deploy the deployment components, which actually leads into one of the questions that was asked. So we're going to do that now. We're going to go into the Q&A. As I said, I've got about half a dozen or so different questions here. So if you have questions, go ahead and ask them. I'll be triaging the rest of them and what have you. Couple of things for additional information, though. So on the Curiosity website, we have a great overview of today's webinar, and this is actually where we'll be posting a link to the recording. It's also where you're able to schedule a consultation. So that's where you'll be able to connect with Hugh and Chris, discuss your challenges, and then we'll be able to set up a workshop or point you in the appropriate direction as well. So definitely invite you to check out that link on the left-hand side. And then on the right-hand side, we've got a link to the Parasoft YouTube channel. This is where we have a series of different YouTube videos that show the different capabilities of the Parasoft suite. Not only the service virtualization and virtual test data that we're talking about today, but also Parasoft Selenic for streamlining your Selenium UI test automation practice, as well as API testing with SOAtest that Hugh was also talking about earlier, and a whole bunch of great content there as well. So with that being said, let's go ahead and kind of dig into some of the questions. And actually, as I said, I was answering some of them through the chat channel, so I'll kind of go back to some of those in a minute. Firstly, just a point of order, yes, the slides will be available after today's session, and as I said, you'll be able to get access to the recording right there in the view. So let me ask the first question to you guys, though, because actually it talks directly to the last point that I was making, which is, how does this work with Docker and containerized environments? So I'll throw this at you first, Hugh, and then you can talk about RIP and then, sorry, VIP.
RIP,
then,
I like it.
RIP, yes. I think I got coronavirus on mine. And then we'll kind of throw it over to Chris to talk about the virtual environment as well. So go ahead, Hugh.
Yeah, so basically what we've done is sitting behind the test modeler tool is a product called VIP, which is Visual Integration Processor, which is kind of RPA for DevOps. Now, what we've got there is we've got all the connectors into Docker, so we can, provision any kind of Kubernetes Docker images that you care about. So I guess the idea is that any kind of provisioning that you need, which could be, maybe you're provisioning a Solr database or a SQL Server database or whatever, just becomes an extra source target to us. Now, there's usually some kind of manifest to say, as part of this particular build or this set of automated tests, I need the following. Now, that following is going to include a set of test cases, automated test cases most likely, and we then know which particular types of data need to be pushed into those Docker images. Now, if you think about that, that's in kind of one dimension, but actually when you're coming to all the different types of testing that's going on at the same time, this ability to spin up these Docker images is actually incredibly powerful, because you can kind of, right, we've now hit 2 or 3 bugs, so we're going to have to explode the level of coverage that we're doing for our normal automated tests. So we're going to drive up the amount of data and the amount of Docker images, because each one could be a different set of configurations. So it's just a particular way that you configure the provisioning of the data. You just attach in that this is actually a Docker container, and that just becomes an end source for us. The cleverness is kind of linking that almost to the model, because the model is actually a description of what the system is supposed to do. The level of coverage is actually based upon almost a rule-based system, which in effect you would be saying, this is a very risky release, or this is a very severe bug, therefore we're going to increase the risk, therefore we then want to increase the level of coverage, therefore we're going to auto-generate either more data or more complex scenarios. And all of that then would kind of give you that multi-dimensional scalability in terms of the specific test cases, but also the breadth of them dependent on the risk profile. Okay. Does that anything to add on that then, Chris or Mark?
Yeah, thanks for that side. So that's from the VIP side. But once all that data is then generated, we want to be able to throw it into a dynamic or referenced architecture. And those who were keen-eyed through the demonstration might have noticed that this entire demonstration was actually done inside of a Docker instance in a Kubernetes cluster in EC2. And so the software for deploying and developing those virtual databases is available as a Docker image. You can spin up those servers inside Docker or inside of your cloud native applications, and then deploy or destroy those test environments all via APIs. And so through that, whether you're using Docker for your applications or you want to use Docker for the software to test them, or a combination of both, you're supported on both fronts.
So actually, Chris, I think that leads us into the next question that I'd like to ask, and we'll kind of start that with you, and then kind of hand over to Hugh. So the question is, how does this integrate with Jenkins? And I think really what you were just talking about there around the reference architecture and the dynamic test environment is kind of one of the great ways of integrating with Jenkins. So I'll hand over to you, and then I'll hand over to Hugh.
Sure. Thanks, Mark. As far as deploying those environments, provisioning them, choosing the different data sets, and executing your test cases, all of those can be done as build steps inside of Jenkins. We at Parasoft have a series of plugins that we've developed for Jenkins for those specific purposes. And so typically to facilitate continuous testing as a function of code check-ins, in your build steps or in your build process, you would then go and call into Parasoft and say, hey, I need you to deploy this virtual service, grab the test data, which Hugh will describe, inject it into whatever I need, deploy that environment either on-premise or up in the cloud, run the test cases, destroy it, and then gate the Jenkins build based on the success or failure of those test results. And so that's it from a Parasoft perspective. Hugh, I'll throw it over to you.
It's exactly the same. It would probably make more sense if if you actually called us, because you know the data that you need for your test cases. So all you have to do is just invoke us, using the API, using the REST call, or command scripts, or whatever you want. So we would probably in that scenario just sit underneath you, and it's exactly the same. We just have a source, we have an instruction, we just go and populate the right data, right time, in the right place.
Great. So we talked about the CI/CD pipeline. I'm trying to bring these things into some kind of sequence here. So the next one we'll talk about is around versioning. And it says, how does the test data provisioning handle testing across different versions and different combinations of versions? So Hugh, I'll hand that over to you. And then Chris, you might want to talk a little bit about testing of different versions of the APIs. I think that might be a kind of an interesting related conversation, but Hugh, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very interesting space, this. I did actually write an article on advanced API testing in Test Magazine about this about 2 or 3 years ago. The versioning of APIs is an absolute nightmare. I think Facebook basically force you to use 3 versions, and then you're out. But of course, back in the real world, we can't really do that. So I think the thinking is we've actually done some work with one customer, and this is creating a dependency manifest. So in effect, you're saying this API can work with this. It can't work with this one, it can work with that one. So it's a sort of classic manifest matrix that needs to be built. And the test data is exactly the same. If you think about test data, the test data is populating API. If the field is not there, it may fail. If it's populated with a default value, it may fail. So you just got to think about the test data as almost code, because the definitions, and actually not the definitions, but the metadata itself is actually controlling the behavior of whatever the API is doing. So you almost have to bring that test data, just like you would have to in the real world with your real application, into that manifest. But from our point of view, it is a publish or an action inside the test data hopper with a set of version numbers passed into it for us to be able to handle that. So we have our own versioning, which would then obviously link back into the Parasoft API versioning.
Wonderful. And then from the Parasoft side, Hugh, I couldn't agree with you more about the API maintenance and change being one of the biggest nightmares. It's unfortunate. It's one of the things that people think about later on in their API maturity, or that their API testing maturity. They build all these great test cases with great test data, and then the API changes. The order of the elements move. Maybe a new element shows up, and then everything sort of explodes. And so for Parasoft, we've actually built in capabilities specifically to tackle this challenge. It's called Parasoft's Change Advisor. And that, plus a combination of other processes, allows us to understand when the APIs are changing, to get a little warning and an identification that says, hey, this service version has changed, the definition has changed, the schemas have changed. We then can, through AI, create a map that will map one version of the API to the other, so that you can then create those new API tests, leveraging the same data connections to your data source that you had in the previous version, and then fill in the gaps with new default data for elements that are brand new, and then leveraging the data from the Curiosity data sets and their versioning, you can seamlessly transition from version to version with minimal impact to the team.
Great. And now the next two questions I'm actually going to weave together, and then I'm going to fire them at you, Chris. I don't know, Hugh, you might have something to add, but I'll fire them at Chris first. So how many rows of live or production database do you copy into the virtual environment? That's the first question. And then the related question is how to simulate the performance problems. And for me, this is all about the seeds, right? How we're recording those interactions with the backend database, which also you might want to touch upon that, because that is another question here, which is how do we record? So I realize I'm loading you with three things there, Chris, but no, I know you can handle it.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. The recording process is connected to the test cases that are executing. And so what we recommend is that you make your connections between your application and the database, which we listen to via monitoring, and then you fire off a set of tests that represent the different calls to the database to support those types of tests, or to APIs. This isn't just for databases. From that, what you will have is an initial seed of data, which basically says, okay, this is what the schema for this API looks like, and you can also serve it the service definitions to fill in gaps that you didn't record. From that, you then have data for a particular entity. Something that Hugh was showing was, we've got the accounts, we have the transactions, we have the customers. You can then use that data to fill in the gaps in other test cases that you might not have recorded. And obviously through data modeling, you can extend that all the way. But you only need a subset of recordings to create that initial schema. Now, before I hand that over to Hugh for that piece, I do want to add on, when it comes to performance, there's an additional layer on that, which is how quickly do my virtual services respond? We can define a performance configuration. We call it a performance profile. And you can either do that by hand or leverage systems like AppDynamics or Dynatrace to give you the realistic performance characteristics of that real service or that real database. And then in the Parasoft world, you can say, I need you to perform this same way. And what that allows you to do is to not only have realistic performance of the environment, but in a performance test, generate a whole whack of data based on, the initial seeds, set the performance configuration, and then use that virtual database in lieu of the real database. So you can do performance testing in a dynamic environment, in a reference environment, and maybe in a container, so that you don't have to use the performance environment for everything. That allows you to start shifting left that performance testing activity to the earlier phases. So let me hand it over to Hugh then, just if you have anything that you want to add to that, and then Mark, let me know if I missed anything in that.
Not so much. Yeah, I think as long as you record enough traffic at the beginning, it's just the variety of traffic that you're interested to start with. I would say on the performance testing, one thing we are seeing is, because people are using queues a lot now, one of the advantages of synthetic data is that you can actually set up just a vast amount of these synthetic queue injection engines. And the key there is to make sure that you have a completely, a large variety of data. The biggest problem with performance testing is that you're actually just testing the same SQL clause. So being able to throw, you know, a couple of million rows of data at a queue, it's great. That was, you know, that's going to hammer the system. But then if you can vary the data to cover all the different types of transactions, that's when you're actually going to see these kind of blocks and things happening as well. So, you know, that is one of the advantages of synthetic data, is to actually use that through that queue process. Otherwise, you know, you could also consider just bulking up the data, which is boring, but, you know, I suppose you have to do it at some stage.
Yeah, and I think actually that actually pivots nicely into one of the questions which was asking about recording and talking about masking. I mean, I think, you know, I'll fire this one to you, but I mean, kind of from my perspective is you're recording a set of seeds, but the whole point of synthetic generated data is that you don't need to worry about masking because it's clean by definition, right? So, and I know that's something you and I have talked about over the years.
Yeah, I mean, the thing with, you know, the reality is what I prefer to do is to record kind of live traffic and then analyze it for characteristics and then synthesize based on the characteristics. You know, then, you know, you're using completely synthetic data, but it has the same characteristics, you know, as production data. That's by far the best way of doing it, rather than attempting to mask data, because you'd invariably something will sneak through, you know, and I just don't think that's, you know, certainly under GDPR, and I think under California laws probably soon.
Yeah.
It's certainly, you know, using the data for testing a system was never something that people would agree to. Name anyone that would ever say, yeah, that's fine, you carry on, use my data for testing, go for it.
No, I've got horror stories from airlines that I've worked with in the past where they've used production data in their test environment and then took a subset of their tests, ran them in the smoke test in production environment, and reset one of their premium frequent flyers status to 0 twice. So and that customer was not a happy chappy. So yeah, you have to be really careful with that. And really, I think to kind of to make sure we pointedly answer the question is masking, you know, shouldn't be a problem. Don't do that. Don't take your production data and try and mask it. You will forget something. Synthetic data is the right approach, and you know, use that as your default. And then very last question that we have here, which actually probably just puts us in the right time, is actually just for you, Chris, I think, is and you kind of answered this already, but I'm going to answer it anyway, ask it anyway. What about if I am connected to a service, not directly to the actual database?
Right. So service virtualization is often referred to as API virtualization. We see that databases are low-hanging fruit. You can get a whole bunch of additional coverage and much more return on investment when you start with those as targets. But service virtualization is applicable for APIs, you know, RESTful, SOAP services, asynchronous services, as Hugh was pointing out. And so the principles are exactly the same. You put a proxy in between your application and your target dependency. Maybe let's say that's a RESTful API onto a data service or a data lake. You record that. The transactions are then created. They're actually put into that exact same format that you saw today. All the principles are exactly the same. And then you can either use that, manually alter it, or send it off to Curiosity to build it up, build the model, and then you're virtualizing your APIs and your databases. And that's how you truly create a virtual environment unconstrained.
Great. Well, thank you, guys. I think we've gone through all of the questions and we're right at time. So thank you very much, Hugh. Pleasure as always. Chris, I'd say a pleasure. Yeah, I'll say pleasure as always for you as well.
Yeah, pleasure. Thanks a lot,
everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Hugh. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day, and stay tuned for other emails from Parasoft. You'll see that we're running a webinar series at the moment, so you'll you know, watch out for those emails. You'll see some more things coming over the coming weeks. So thanks again, everybody. Have a great rest of your day.